Hello, my name is Emma, and today I am going to teach you the H.E.A.R.T approach. The H.E.A.R.T approach is great for dealing with unhappy customers or clients in the workplace. So let me ask you a question. How would you deal with an unhappy customer or client? So this is a common interview question when you apply for jobs in customer service. Today, I'm going to teach you the H.E.A.R.T approach, which is a great answer to this question. So the H.E.A.R.T approach stands for hear, empathize, apologize, respond, and thank. We will look at each of these components of the H.E.A.R.T approach, and I will give you some example English sentences on how we can do each of these. Okay, so let's start by talking about the H in H.E.A.R.T. The H stands for hear. So when you're dealing with an unhappy customer, it's important to hear what they're saying and to really listen to them. I think nowadays we're actually losing the ability to be good listeners. So it's very important to try hard to really listen to what the customer is telling you. Don't interrupt them when they're talking. Let them say what they have to say. You might even repeat back some of what they said so they know you're listening. So for example, the customer says something, you might say, okay, I want to make sure I understand, what you're saying, so I can help you better. You're saying X, Y, Z, or you're saying this, you're saying that. So it's always a good idea to repeat back what you understood just to make sure you got the message right. Okay, so we talked about the H, which stands for hear. Now let's talk about the E in H.E.A.R.T, which stands for empathize. So what do I mean by empathize? Well, when we talk about empathy or empathizing, what we're talking about is imagining the other person's perspective. So you have an unhappy customer. It's a good idea to imagine yourself in their position. Try to see things from their perspective. You might disagree, but still, it's a good idea to try to imagine where they're coming from. We have an idiom in English. We often say, put yourself in their shoes. And this means try to see the world from their perspective. And here are some great sentences you can say to do this. You can say, oh, I can see why your situation would be frustrating. Oh, I can see why that's frustrating. Or, I understand what you're saying. I understand that would upset me too. By saying these types of sentences, you validate somebody's feelings and you tell them, you know what? Your opinion or your perspective is important and understandable. And by doing this, you can make an unhappy customer feel better. So this is the E in H.E.A.R.T. It stands for empathize. Okay, so the H stands for hear. The E stands for empathize. What about the A? The A in H.E.A.R.T. stands for apologize. So apologize means I'm sorry. When we say I'm sorry, we are apologizing. So what you can say to an unhappy customer is you can simply say, I'm sorry you had this experience. I'm sorry you had this experience. Okay, well, a lot of people ask, but it's not my fault the customer had this experience. Maybe the customer is angry, but it's not because of anything you or your company did. So what do you do if you didn't do anything wrong? Well, you can still apologize for how someone feels or their experience, and it does not mean you are taking the responsibility or the blame. So when I say, I'm sorry for your experience, this means I feel sad you had this experience, this negative experience. It does not necessarily mean you're the person who caused the experience or you're to blame. So in customer service, we often use this. I'm sorry for your experience. And again, it validates the customer and it makes them feel like you understand where they're coming from and you feel bad about it. So now let's look at the R in heart. All right, so we talked about the H, which is for hear, the E, which is for empathize, the A, which is for apologize, and now we are at the R. R stands for respond or resolve. So what do I mean by this? Well, so you've heard the customer, you have empathized with them, you've said, oh, I'm sorry for your experience. Now is when you try to help them. So the big question is, how are you going to help them? What will you do? And this can actually be a little bit difficult because sometimes there's not much you can do with an unhappy customer. Sometimes it might just be saying something like, I'm going to look into this for you. And so that means that you're going to investigate or try to figure out what happened. You might say, if it applies, you might say, I'll talk to my manager about this. Or maybe I'll let the staff know about your concerns. It might even be that you might tell them you'll look into it and email them or do a follow-up phone conversation. The key is whatever you promise, you should do. So don't make big promises you can't fulfill. But think what there usually is at least something. Even if it's small, there's often something you can do to help the customer or to make them feel that you're taking this seriously. So the R is for respond. And now let's look at the T. All right. So we did hear, empathize, apologize, respond or resolve. And now we're on the T of heart. The T stands for thank. So after you have done all the other steps, the very last thing you do is you thank the client or the customer. So, and it can be very simple. You can just say, thank you for sharing your experience. So this is a great way to end the conversation. Thank them, because it's not always easy to bring up a complaint. And sometimes these complaints or, what the customer says can actually lead to change in your organization. So thank them for bringing their perspective. All right, so we've covered heart. Again, this is a great approach. It's a great approach to use with customers, and it's a great approach to talk about if you are ever in a job interview and the interviewee says, what do you do when you have an unhappy customer? The heart approach is a great answer. So thank you so much for watching. You can check out our website at www.engvid.com, and there you can actually do a quiz to practice what you learned today. Remember, practice makes perfect. So thanks so much for watching, and until next time, take care.